Hi everyone again, we're back now. We're doing our part 2 of the TEAS science portion. And we're going to pick back up where we left off. We were on the immune system before. We were talking about blood, and I just wanted to go over real quickly because we're on the topic of the immune system, and I want to talk a little bit more about white blood cells for a minute, but just kind of wanted to do a quick rundown on the components of blood. We know blood has two main components. It has plasma, which is of course the liquid portion of blood, and then it has the formed elements. Platelets, not going to say a lot about them, but they're not true cells. They're just cell fragments, and obviously they're involved in clotting, and they're involved in the healing and repair process. Wherever platelets go, yes, clotting occurs, but also healing and tissue regrowth and repair occur. Now, the red blood cell, we're not going to again say too much about this right now, but the red blood cell is involved in oxygen transport. So that's its big function. It uses hemoglobin, which is on the red blood cell, to transport the oxygen, okay, to where oxygen needs to go. The whole point of talking about this is talking about the white blood cell, because we were talking about the first lines of defense for the immune system, the second, and then the third. Well, when we get into the third line, we really get into the specific types of defense. And that's where we get into white blood cells. I wanted to talk real quickly about the different types of white blood cells. And we're going to have neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. Okay, these three are white blood cells. Okay, they're referred to as granulocytes, and that is simply because they contain granules. They degranulate when they are basically in killing mode. Okay, so if we looked under a microscope, we see these cells, we're going to physically be able to see the granules. Okay, so again, we refer to these as granulocytes. Then there are two, the lymphocytes and the monocytes. These two would be referred to as agranulocytes. And that simply means that they have no granules. They kill in a different method. And we could talk about these really quickly, because each one has an important purpose. If you ever go to the doctor and have a CBC ordered, one of the things that is on the CBC is your white blood cell count and typically your white blood cell differential. This is your differential here. It gives the outlay of your white blood cell subtypes and tells us the levels. So if you had an infection, and by the way, since we're talking about the immune system, hallmark of infection, and this is important to know for the TEAS, hallmark of infection is elevated white blood cells. So typically, if you have elevated white blood cells, you have an infection. If you have normal white blood cell levels, you don't have an infection. I mean, that's, again, a good rule of thumb. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. Low white blood cell count is not common, but you do see it with certain problems associated with things like radiation therapy, chemotherapy, odd infections. I mean, rare. You might see low white blood cell count, but that's, again, those are not the norm. Most of the time, elevated white blood cells are going to be seen with infection. So if you had elevated white blood cells, then you would go and you'd want to know what the differential looks like. If, for instance, neutrophils were elevated, which was causing the overall, white blood cell count to go up. By the way, it's greater than 10,000 white blood cells would be elevated. Okay. If neutrophils were elevated, we would expect to see a bacterial infection. Okay, so neutrophils kill bacteria. Okay, and they would be elevated when they're fighting bacteria. Eosinophils typically deal with parasite infections. They also deal with allergic reactions, so we might see these elevated for those reasons. Basophils, a little unique. The main thing I tell students to remember about these is we see these, the basophils triggering histamine and heparin. Okay, histamine and heparin. Lymphocytes in general And we'll talk about these. These have 3 subtypes that we'll talk about. These kill a lot of different things, but in general, on a white blood cell count, we see these fighting viral infection, okay, the lymphocyte. The monocyte is a macrophage. So that means they're involved in phagocytosis. So what are they doing? Monocytes are basically killing foreign debris, dead cells. By phagocytosis means they're eating the dead cells, okay? What about the lymphocytes? They have 3 subtypes. There is the B cell, there is the T cell, and there is the natural killer cell. Now, to give a rundown of lymphocytes, the T cell is about 80% of all lymphocytes. Okay, so these are the most numerous. These would do most of the, I guess you'd say, infection fighting for the lymphocyte. And they do a unique type of fighting we call, it's basically an indirect type of fighting involving antigen-presenting cells. Okay, the antigen-presenting cell is simply a cell that literally takes the antigen, you know, this foreign substance that can make you sick, processes it, which is kind of lengthy steps, processes it and then presents it to the T cell, in which case then the T cell would kill it. Okay, so it's a little bit involved, I guess you'd say. The B cell is only about 15% of all the lymphocytes. And what the B cells do is they are responsible for making antibodies. So when you get a vaccine or just get sick in general, fight off some infection, for instance, you got chickenpox, let's say, you fought it off, one of the things your body would do is create antibodies for that. The B cells, again, would be responsible for making those antibodies. And of course, that would give you a memory, lifelong memory if you have chickenpox, to the point where you never get chickenpox again. Okay. So B cells are responsible for making antibodies. The natural killer cell then is only about 5% of all lymphocytes, and it's going to kill everything. That's what I tell students to remember, is it literally kills everything. It kills bacteria, viruses, foreign tissue like transplanted tissue, because that is foreign to our body. It's going to try to eliminate it. Cancer cells are eliminated by the natural killer cell. We got to remember that an abnormal cell, really by definition, is a cancer cell. It's a cell that's basically, of course, not supposed to be there. Our body has mechanisms in place to kill these cells before they, grow out of hand. And the natural killer cell is one of those cells that does that. So this gives us an idea of kind of the basics of our immune system. Another thing we want to keep in mind, and we're going to mention it in just a little bit, but the lymphatic system is the actual system that controls immunity. Now, you might read in a lot of books that there is no true immune system, and that really is true because it's really just cells, okay? It's not a true organ system. The organ system would be lymphatic, and again, it would be in charge of immunity, okay? So keep that in mind as we're talking about some of this. So some other systems I want to talk about now. Next system, again, we're not going to talk too much about these systems, but we'll just hit the high points. Again, your goal is to listen to this and go back and review, okay? Endocrine system. Super important system. Anytime you hear the word endocrine, your brain should automatically think hormones. So this system is going to be the glands and the organs that make hormones. Okay, could it be anything like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which, by the way, we have a video on that. The hypothalamus and pituitary are big players in the endocrine system, so watch my other video on that to get more specific details. And then we have, organs like the pancreas, which makes insulin and glucagon. Again, a whole host of glands in the body. Really, what you want to be able to do is do a quick review of those glands and organs, to review, what hormone they make, or hormones plural, and what the function of those hormones is. Okay. Key thing about the endocrine system is hormones are basically chemicals that are secreted by, gland or organ, and they're secreted directly into the bloodstream. That's what makes it unique. Some of these same chemicals can be used as neurotransmitters too in the nervous system. Well, what's the difference? Well, in the nervous system, the chemical would be secreted into a synapse. Same chemical, we would call it a hormone when it's in the bloodstream. We would call it a neurotransmitter when it's in a synapse. Now, what about the difference between an endocrine gland versus exocrine? Well, an exocrine gland, and many of you know this, is basically going to make a secretion, which means something useful for the body. Could be mucus, could be a serous secretion, could even be milk, right? Because the milk, the mammary glands, are an exocrine gland. Sperm and egg cells are exocrine secretions, okay? So we have a lot of exocrine secretions, or secretions that are useful for the body, but they're not hormones, which means they're not being secreted in the bloodstream. They're being secreted through ducts, okay? And that's the key thing to remember. Exocrine glands have ducts. No ducts up here on the endocrine side, okay? Sweat glands would be exocrine glands, to use that example. Oil glands that we have on our face and on our scalp, those are also exocrine, okay? So keep that in mind as we're talking about the differences between the two, okay? Let's talk about another one now. We're going to talk about the integumentary system. The integumentary system is going to be the system for skin, hair, nails, and our cutaneous glands. Glands, again, like sweat and oil, to use a good couple examples there. This is our biggest system overall, largest because of obviously the surface area that skin covers. It is also the heaviest system because, again, of all the skin that we have in our body. Good idea is to go back and review the type of tissue that involves some of the layers of the integumentary system. For instance, when we're referring to skin, we're really referring to the outer layer, which we call the epidermis. This is our outer layer, right? So we're literally look at epidermis. Epidermis is made of stratified, squamous, spell that right, epithelium, and it has a keratin layer on it. So it's referred to as keratinized. It has this outer layer of keratin that makes it extra tough, and it makes it waterproof. So that would be what epidermis is. And then we have a deeper layer of skin referred to as dermis, and this is made of connective tissue. So I'll just abbreviate CT. This is connective tissue. Okay, so that would be by definition skin. Now, in the epidermis, we really don't have a lot. We have majority, when you look under a microscope and look at epidermis, majority of it is these stratified squamous epithelial cells. We have some other cells mixed in with that. They're very sparse. We would have keratinocytes mixed in, and we'd have some stem cells mixed in, dendritic cells. We have melanocytes, which produce melanin. We have a whole host of cells mixed in with the stratified squamous. But again, when you look under a microscope, majority of it is just covered in these stratified squamous cells. Again, it is stratified, which means it is multi-layered. It has more than 2 layers of epithelial cells. And we look at the dermis again is connective tissue. We see a lot more, I guess you'd say, stuff in there, because this is really where our sweat glands are going to be, and our oil glands, and where our erector pili muscles are for the hairs. This is where our blood vessels are. One of the unique things about epidermis is it contains no blood vessels. It actually receives oxygen from the dermis, from the underlying layers. It receives oxygen by diffusion. Okay, so that's one of the unique things about epidermis. There are no blood vessels. Okay, nerve endings are also sparse, so we see more nerve endings here in the dermis. And we also see the hair follicle and what we call the bulb and the root. That is within the dermis. Okay, so we have a lot more, I guess you'd say, stuff. So that really is what we refer to when we say skin. Okay. So then, what would be below that? Just to let you know, we would see hypodermis, which is also still a connective tissue. Specifically, what type of connective tissue it would be fat. Okay, and that would be below the dermis layer. Again, not really considered part of skin. It would be considered under the skin or deep to the skin. Okay, so that gives us a little quick rundown. Again, nails are in this category, hair is in this category. So you could do a little bit of review on that as well. Again, hair would grow basically from the living part of the hair, which would be the follicle, and that would be in the dermis. And then we'd have a bulb, a root, and then a shaft. The shaft is what comes out of the skin. That's what we cut, would be the shaft of the hair. And there is a life cycle to the hair as well. And so that would be something that, of course, you could review. You could also review the different types of burns, first, second, and third degree burns, because those would be involved in integumentary system. Pretty straightforward there. First degree burn involves epidermis. Second degree involves epidermis and a little dermis. And then third basically involves epidermis or all of epidermis and all of dermis. So it's a very deep, straight through the skin burn. Another thing you could review is cancer, skin cancer. The three most common types: basal cell, squamous cell, and the malignant melanoma, which involve the melanocyte. So, good review on that. That's going to be our integumentary system. Why don't we jump and mention lymphatic just for a minute? We kind of already mentioned lymphatic. We said that this is really going to be in control of the immune system. The lymphatic system uses a separate set of vessels that circulate a fluid called lymph throughout the body. And what are some of the organs in this system? Well, the thymus, which is hidden behind the sternum, would be a lymphatic organ. And some of the other things would be things like lymph nodes, which are a lymphatic organ, which contain lymphocytes. So they're going to help fight infection in a more local area of the body. Tonsils. You've got three types of tonsils. And of course, the tonsils are going to be a lymphatic organ because they're involved in the immune system and fighting infection. The appendix fights infection. Okay, and it's on the very beginning of the large intestine, on the cecum. It contains lymphocytes as well. We've got other areas of the body like the ileum. That's the end of the small intestine. That is Peyer's patches, which again are lymphatic tissue. So we've got a lot of different areas of the body. It's all immune fighting related. Okay, so good review on that. We kind of already discussed it when we talked about the immune system. So then we move on to the muscular system. When we're talking about muscular, your brain might think, oh, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, but muscular system specifically is skeletal muscle. Why is it specifically skeletal muscle? Because cardiac muscle is going to deal with the heart and the cardiovascular system, so we kind of already discussed that a little bit. Smooth muscle is going to deal with all the other organs, and so we would typically, put those smooth muscles in each organ system relative to the organ that we're talking about. So really, the muscular system is strictly skeletal muscle, which is of course what we call somatic muscle, which is our voluntary muscle. Okay. Again, we have over 600 muscles in the human body. I would be surprised if the TEAS test asked a lot about this. The only things I would see the TEAS test maybe asking is basic questions about the muscular system in general. For instance, things like origin versus insertion. That would be important. Those are attachments, where the skeletal muscles attach. So one thing we could say about it is an origin is always the less movable, or put another way, the more stationary attachment. Okay? Good example is if I'm looking at my biceps brachii and it's a muscle that flexes the elbow, okay, so I'm flexing, I'm going to have two attachments without even going into detail on what those attachments specifically are. One of them is origin, one of them is an insertion. Well, as I move my elbow here, and this is the prime function of the biceps brachii, is to flex the elbow. The origin is going to have to be up here, the more proximal end. Why? Because this is the less movable end. as I'm flexing my elbow, we're not really getting a lot of movement up here. Where's all the movement? The movement's at the elbow. So that would be the insertion. The elbow attachment would be the insertion, and that happens to be the radial tuberosity on the radius, okay? That's what we call my insertion. So less movable attachment, more movable attachment. I always tell students a good rule of thumb is whatever bone is moving the most, in this case, it would be the radius. I mean, the ulna moves as well, but the radius is where the biceps attaches. Whichever bone moves the most, that's the insertion. Obviously, whatever bone moves the least, that's the origin. Okay, so you always want to think big picture when you think about muscles. You kind of have to visualize things from an X-ray standpoint. Another thing that you could review would be things like what's an agonist versus an antagonist. Agonist is the muscle that is the prime mover in any particular movement. For instance, when I'm flexing my elbow, the prime mover, that would be the muscle in charge, is the brachialis. It produces the most force. The synergist would be any muscles that help out. The biceps brachii helps out, okay? The antagonist then would be the opposite muscle group. So if I'm flexing, then my opposite group is going to have to extend, okay? So what extends? Triceps brachii. That's my antagonist. Okay, good rule of thumb on that. The agonist and the antagonist are typically going to be on opposite sides of the body. If we're dealing with the pectorals, the pectoralis major, my antagonists are going to have to be literally on the back side of my body, the rhomboids. Okay, so it's typically going to be in the opposite side of the body because they're going to do the opposite movement. Okay, and the other part of all this is the fixator muscles that stabilize. As I'm flexing my elbow, I do have muscles of the pectoral girdle that are stabilizing my scapula so that I'm not, flinging my scapula all over the place as I flex. So those are some different categories that you can review. Another thing could be the difference between a direct and indirect muscle, or direct and indirect attachment, however the book words it. Indirect attachments are the most common, and that simply uses tendons to attach the muscle to bone. Okay, that's the most common scenario. Direct attachment would basically have no visible tendon. Those are typically going to be seen in small muscles. Muscles in the hands, muscles in the face, muscles in the feet are not going to have visible tendons, typically, not all, but many. And so we would call those direct attachments. We would also refer to those being that they're in one region, they're contained in one region. We call those indirect muscles. The longer muscles of the body, we would call, I'm sorry, I might have said indirect, they're called intrinsic muscles. The longer muscles of the body are referred to as extrinsic muscles. Okay, so small muscles, intrinsic, longer muscles that basically originate and insert in different areas of the body or different regions, that's going to be extrinsic muscles. So throw some terms out there. Good review, I would say that's probably the big things to go over. Another thing to just review, talked about it in part one just a little bit, but the difference between the tendon and the ligament again, they would involve the muscular system, kind of, sort of. Tendons, like we said, attach muscles to bone. So that's the important thing to remember. So they are definitely intimately involved in the muscular system. Ligaments attach bone to bone. So their job is to hold the joint together. So they're our joint stabilizer, not the tendon. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're talking about that. So moving on, we'll just briefly talk about the reproductive system. The reproductive system, of course, is going to be for reproduction. Big organs in the reproductive system for the male, of course, testes. That is considered the primary organ. The primary organ for the female is going to be the ovaries. Okay, why are those primary? Because those make the hormones. Those are endocrine, right? The male hormone, of course, is testosterone, also referred to as androgens. Female hormones are going to be estrogen and progesterone. Those are the two big dominant hormones. Those hormones begin being secreted for both the man and the woman at puberty. all the changes that we see at puberty are triggered by those hormones. For the female, it's primarily triggered by estrogen, and of course for the male, it's testosterone. Now, those two organs are also primary because not only do they make hormones, but they make the exocrine secretions that we talked about, the sperm for the male, the egg for the female. The uterus is obviously a reproductive organ for the female, but it's not considered primary. It doesn't make the hormones or any particular exocrine secretion. There are some secretions that come from it, but it's not considered, again, the primary organ. Okay? That's probably the big things to talk about right now in the reproductive system. You know, in our textbook, chapters 27, 28, 29, go into a lot more detail in the reproductive system. The endocrinology of the male is important, and how we have a cascade effect from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the testes and the hormones that are involved. That's good to review. Same on the female side. We have the same cascade effect where we have the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary, which is stimulating the ovaries, which then hormones from the ovaries, the estrogen and progesterone, then stimulate the uterus. So it's good to review some of those hormones involved, and of course just the cycle for the female, because we have this 28-day cycle that occurs both in the ovary and in the uterus. So we have an ovarian cycle in the ovary and a menstrual cycle in the uterus. All good to review when we're dealing with the reproductive system. Okay? But I want to move ahead a little bit and talk about the skeletal system. Skeletal system is obviously primarily going to deal with bone. Bone is a connective tissue. Again, talking about bone, we do need to talk about ligaments a little bit. Ligaments would, like we said, hold bones together. We talk about cartilage when we talk about the skeletal system, because of course cartilage lines the ends of the bone where they're located at the joint. We could mention the three types of cartilage here too. And the three types of cartilage would be hyaline. Should I spell it right? Hyaline cartilage. This is the type of cartilage that lines the joints. Hyaline cartilage. So our synovial joints are lined by this hyaline cartilage. We see hyaline probably the most numerously in the body. We see it in the thyroid cartilage. It makes up the cartilaginous portions of the ribs, the trachea. It is the cartilage of the growth plate. It's also the cartilage of the fetal skeleton. Our skeleton as a whole begins as hyaline cartilage and converts to bone during the fetal stage. Okay. So we see hyaline cartilage quite a bit. This is a smooth and glassy type of cartilage. Another type is going to be elastic. Good example, let's see this in the ears. It's very flexible cartilage. Okay. And then the final type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage is the most dense, coarse, tough cartilage. Typically see this in just a few areas of the body. All of our vertebral discs are made of the fibrocartilage type. It's much tougher, it's much denser, it's better at absorbing shock. The meniscus of the knees, we have 2 in each knee. Those also absorb shock. Those are made of fibrocartilage. We also have some fibrocartilage in the TMJ joint. There's a lot of stress in that joint, temporomandibular joint, and in the pubic symphysis. So that's where we see fibrocartilage. One of the unique things about cartilage, and it is a connective tissue, falls under that category, is the only connective tissue that does not have blood vessels. So it is avascular. Again, that is unique. It would receive oxygen from diffusion again. So that makes that a bit unique, because all other connective tissues have, in fact, lots of blood vessels, okay? Lots of blood flow. So again, that makes it unique. But dealing with bone, we're dealing with the skeletal system. Bone, the two types of bone real fast would be spongy and compact. Compact is always the outer portion of bone that we see on the surface. Spongy would be the inner. Spongy looks like a sponge. It's hollow. It would contain bone marrow, okay? Compact would not. It is denser. That's why we call it compact. And, you know, another thing you could do is review the parts of a long bone. Deal with the long bones. We have some specific parts. The ends are the epiphysis. The shaft is the diaphysis. There is a marrow cavity inside long bones where bone marrow would be. There would be spongy bone with bone marrow as well, but the marrow cavity would have bone marrow in it. Could also review the types of bone marrow. That is important as well. Red bone marrow is considered active bone marrow. Okay, yellow bone marrow is inactive. Adults have both yellow and red. Children are pretty much 100% red. And again, active bone marrow just means it's actively making blood cells. Okay, yellow bone marrow is basically inactive or dormant, but in emergency situations where you needed more blood cells, the yellow can be basically reactivated again. Okay. So a quick rundown on the skeletal system there for you. Talk about another system, urinary system. So we're dealing with urinary. We're obviously dealing with some key things. Most important organ, of course, for the urinary system is the kidneys. Okay. Function of the kidneys has a lot of functions. The main function of the kidneys is, of course, to filter out waste. You know, these people that we know that have to undergo dialysis basically 3 days a week, they basically got either kidneys that don't function properly anymore. Sometimes they've had their kidneys removed for different reasons. They're not able to filter out the waste in their blood on their own. They have to use the dialysis machine to do that. But that's what our kidneys do. They filter the waste out of our blood, okay? Obviously, they produce urine. From the kidneys, we have little tubes called ureters that go to the bladder. And of course, the bladders are a holding tank for urine. We're always making urine 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Bladder holds it, okay, until it fills, tells us we gotta go. And then the urethra, of course, is how we get rid of it. Those are the big organs, okay? The kidney is a complex little organ. Our functional unit for the kidney that's doing all of the waste removal and urine production is referred to as the nephron. We have roughly 1.2 million nephrons per kidney. So 2.4 million total, okay? So these are microscopic structures within the kidney. Again, they really are the true functional unit of waste removal. Okay, so that would be a good review to go back through the parts of the nephron.